Thank you so much. And thank you guys for joining us. I know that this is such a fascinating topic and everybody wants to know, what does the future of work look like right now for me? And nobody's been on the front lines of that more than you guys have. I was hoping you could just help us set the scene a little bit, take the temperature on where your workforces are at this moment. How many of them are remote, at home, in the office? Just a quick lightning round to give us a sense of where everybody is right now. Kiersten, you want to start with you?
You bet. Good morning, Shelly. It's great to be with you. So we have the vast majority of our workforce coming into work every day in our manufacturing plants and facilities and warehouses. We have about 30,000 employees here in the US who are non-place dependent. That is, their work can be done remotely. And that's the workforce that we've just introduced some changes for in terms of how we're thinking about the evolution of where and how they get work done.
Great. And Tamla?
So here at Waste Management, we have about 40,000 of our frontline employees who never left their place of employment. So they have been working to serve our customers throughout this pandemic. We have another 10,000 employees that are office-based that are working remotely at this time. Our plan is to start transitioning our workforce back on a volunteer basis May 3rd, and ultimately we plan to be back in the office on July 1st. But with that back in the office, we have 3 designations of our workers. So we have those that are deemed as office-based. We also have a portion that's deemed as hybrid, and about 50% of those 10,000 will be remote.
And what about you, Christy?
Thanks. Just building on the other comments. So Verizon, we have about 130,000 employees, and like my co-panelists here, our frontline teams have been working throughout the pandemic. We have employees in our technician and our service teams, as well as our retail store teams. And so that's about 50,000 employees. We also have approximately 20,000 customer care team members that have been working remote. And actually, we've decided to continue having on a remote basis, even post-COVID. And then the balance of our workers have been both a hybrid of working remote and working in the office as needed. And we're going to look to codify all the learnings of the last year as we go forward and hopefully put the pandemic in the rearview mirror.
So clearly not managing such a diverse, different type of workforce. Before we go into the future of work, I was hoping you guys could take a second to kind of reflect on that moment where you knew, this isn't just a temporary thing. Shifting from, okay, it's not just a month of triage. It's actually, this is going to take a real big shift. So, Christy, I was hoping we could start with you telling me a little bit about when you realized that that was going to take a much bigger shift than you probably had initially thought.
Yeah, I think in the March timeframe, we were really all jumped into action. A lot of us had activated our Asia crisis response and Europe crisis response teams in January and February. But as the pandemic moved from Europe to the North American continent, and we also began to see the World Health Organization call it a pandemic, I think that's when we realized, okay, we're in for something that may take a few months. But it wasn't until probably June or July, as there was a second wave working its way through the regions that had first experienced the pandemic, that reality really set in that this was something we were going to be living with for a long time. And with the spikes that were really taxing healthcare systems across many of the countries we worked in, we realized this was going to be with us for probably a year.
And what did that mean for you, that you had to shift that mindset from a temporary fix to a real shift in programming?
From the beginning, we had to stay operational, I think, like my co-panelists. So we tried to take a 3-prong approach. I was sort of leading the day-to-day triage of COVID crisis response so that the business leaders and their teams could be focused on how do we continue to execute, keep people connected, continue to drive services, and a few other team members that stayed focused on the longer term and how COVID might be changing the landscape of what was required from our business going forward. And so as a leadership team, we meet a couple of times a week focusing on the crisis, the delivery on our key priorities, as well as the future and how COVID was affecting that. And for our employees, I think it meant we started Crisis Comms with updates every day, a COVID web page, and a live broadcast. And we've continued to do that for the entire year. And really what it meant for our employees was wanting to just know how were things changing, because around them, whether it was communities, family support, schools, the disease itself, really a lot of unknowns. And so communication from us became almost a constant norm that people were relying on.
So interesting. And I want to shift it over to Kiersten, because you guys actually not only had to shift work, but also the nature of your work altogether with the PPE. Can you take us behind the scenes into what that decision looked like?
No, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's just a great example of innovation and agility. And so very quickly, when we looked at the scarcity of the availability of PPE in the community, our teams huddled and they wanted to very much be part of the solution. And so they did a lot of brainstorming and figuring out how to best help. And given some of our manufacturing facilities were forced to idle early on in the pandemic, that we wanted to convert and use those facilities to make both PPE but also respirators. And full credit to the Ford workforce, because we had so many volunteers. We had more volunteers actually than we could accommodate for employees that really wanted to help and be part of the solution in serving the community.
Are you guys still doing that?
We're still making PPE, that's right, and we're not making respirators at the moment, but should the need arise, we certainly can pivot and continue to do that, but we're continuing to make PPE.
That's great. That's really interesting. And Tamla, I wanted to talk to you because one thing that we spoke about earlier was that you have 5 generations of workforce, of people at your workforce. Can you tell me how you had to kind of address all those different generations and all the different job, descriptions, and how you kind of had to tailor and communicate to each of them?
So the first thing that we done was making sure that our people were safe. So we maintained the integrity of safety for our workforce, both in terms of their environment, but also in terms of their financial safety. So irrespective of their generation, we put their safety first, and how the application of their safety went about was different depending on where they worked. For instance, safety for those folks on the front line meant making sure they had the proper PPE, that their launch protocols and things like that were distanced and socially distanced, and they had the appropriate protocol in place. But for those that were in the office, it meant moving them from working into the office to working from home. And so, again, we wanted to make sure that they were safe, but the application of that safety was different depending on the type of work they were doing and where they were doing it. The other thing that we did, as I said previously, was protecting financial safety of our workforce. In addition to preparing for their physical safety, one of the first things that we did as a leadership team is said to our employees that irrespective of the duration of time of this pandemic, we are going to maintain your financial safety, which meant that we were guaranteeing 40 hours of work, irrespective of the volume. And that helped all generations, right? So depending on where they were, no matter if they're in the office or on the front line, they had the same element of safety. So, we have different types of jobs, driving a truck, technicians, people working in the office. And so we really wanted to treat our employees the same, but the application of that was different depending on the type of work they were doing, not necessarily the generation.
And when did you realize that as you bring people back now, that you weren't going to go back to having everyone in the office?
We learned a lot. We learned a lot, and as my co-panelists have said, we learned a lot during this process. And at first we thought we could never have all these people working remotely, but what we found was with the technology, they were more efficient and more effective and able to do things, in a more transparent way. We were able to see them working in a more transparent way, but it also gave us a competitive advantage. We didn't have, when we're hiring people now, we don't have the geographic restrictions that we once had, and that could make us more nimble as a workforce. And so we looked at, what are we learning from this, and why do jobs really have to be done in the office? Can we not do them differently and do them better? And that's what we've learned. Not all jobs are required to be in the office. And if we do this the right way with the right tools, the right engagement from our leaders, it could be a competitive advantage for us in terms of cost and flexibility and the types of people we're able to attract.
Are you guys already finding that you're able to attract better talent because you're not focused on one geography over another?
Absolutely. We've been doing it. Now, I will tell you that our recruiting process has changed as well, because we've been having to do a lot of recruiting online versus in person. And so while that process has gone a lot faster, we have to be very deliberate about making sure we have a cultural fit. So when we've cast the net for some of our roles now, we can cast it a lot wider, right? And I think as a company, we also garnered a lot of goodwill regarding how we treated our employees. And that, again, that's kind of got people intrigued about working for this company, because we're so much more than waste. We are a profitable company doing socially good things, and we treat our people really well, as evidenced about, how we treated them during this pandemic. And so people are now intrigued. And now that they don't have to come or live in a certain geography, they were like, this is a pretty great place to work. You don't have the same level of volatility that you may have in other markets, because irrespective of what's going on in the world, you're going to always need our services. Imagine a world, or even this pandemic, without a waste management. It would not be a great place to be.
I want to shift over to Christy and ask you a little bit about this idea of change management, because we're finally a year into this. I feel like people are finally in a rhythm again. Okay, I can kind of figure out the stay-at-home thing. I know what the challenges are. I know all of a sudden it's like, okay, now do I have to go back to the office? What's that going to mean? How are you managing employees through that really huge mental burden?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think for our workforce, the last year's brought a lot of changes. One of the things that I think was a highlight for or a silver lining was just the level of innovation and creativity and teamwork that our employees brought forward to come up with creative solutions like touchless retail, or how to do service to customers when we couldn't go into homes. And we created a Tech C app where technicians could service clients from the curbside, or give them materials outside the door and do follow-up calls. So really, we want to tap into that ingenuity. And what we've been doing is just constant communications. We try to give a lot of advance notice. We're constantly communicating what's happening with COVID, what's happening with treatments, what's happening with the vaccine. So we're constantly giving people health and wellness update information, and then talking about what does that mean for ways of working going forward. And what we've been thinking about is, in 2019, we had started Verizon 2.0 and talked a lot about new ways of working. And in a lot of ways, as we found ourselves catapulted into the pandemic, we were actually able to accelerate a lot of those concepts, which were a lot more agile teams working across locations and really challenging some of the traditional norms of everybody being co-located, sitting together in an office. So now, as we look forward, we're thinking about how do we take all those learnings and forward cast those. And so we're doing pilots. Actually, next week, we're kicking off. There'll be about 3,000 employees in pilots across 50 teams in each part of the company, really taking all the learnings and some of the tools that we've built for what the future will look like as we begin to bring forward all of these learnings. And I think through the pilot, we're going to gain a lot of insights. But I think our sense, and I think the employees, we've been surveying them and sharing out the feedback from their input as well. So I think communication, feedback loops, and advance notice are going to be really important. And then there's other things coming into play, like our school's going to be open. What are going to be the protocols? Do people have access to the support that they need that are going to help us as employers come up with all the right ways to have everybody thrive together?
One thing I find so impressive about the pilot program that you're describing is this real intense focus on details, like down to every single process. And you spoke to me earlier about meetings. Meetings used to be in person, and then you'd call the person who, might not be at the office for the day. Then it all went remote, and everybody is in these tiny little boxes, as we're seeing now. And now you have to kind of figure out a hybrid. So how do you do that? And is that precision down to every moment of the day really necessary, do you think?
Well, we're calling our program Work Forward, and we've built a microsite, and on the microsite will be tips and guidelines for teams, and it'll give them insight on if this is the kind of thing you're looking to do, a collaboration and ideation, a personal project, support for a customer. Here's sort of the best ways to do it, and then establishing some norms so that as we continue to navigate the new normal, there's kind of some established protocols, and that'll give people comfort. And I think people knowing what's expected of them is always a really important framework for people to have to know how to be successful, because ultimately people want to be successful. And I think if we don't take the time to clarify some of those things, there'll be this murky unknown and then just a default to what it was before COVID. And I think that would be a shame to lose all of the learning and the progress that we've made. And so for those reasons, we've developed this microsite. We've developed training for employees, for leaders. And one of the things we're doing is really distinguishing two things. There's how do you lead distributed teams, which could be a team where people aren't co-located. I could have a team and I could have team members in 3 or 4 countries, 3 or 4 geographies, states, work locations. And I could have a team where I have a hybrid team where some people may be working in a remote office, on site at a customer, maybe in a Verizon office. So how do I run distributed teams? How do I run remote teams? And we think these are skills that we need to have for our leaders. And I think it's going to be an important part of the world of work going forward. So for those reasons, we're trying to be specific and mindful.
I love that idea of addressing that murkiness, especially when you think of all the people who probably started at your companies during the pandemic and don't know what it used to be like. They only know, the current. I wanted to move over to Ford and Kiersten, ask you a little bit about this idea of risk taking and kind of asking, soliciting feedback from your employees and kind of bringing them along for the journey. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and it builds on Christy's point around change management. So if you think about it, the pandemic was something that was done to us. We didn't feel like we could control it. It created a lot of anxiety and discomfort because we didn't have that sense of control. And so one of the things that that's been a core value in our approach is continually checking in and understanding our employee sentiment and their experience. So similar to what Christy described, we're checking in with our employees every 1 to 2 weeks, asking them how they're feeling, what's working, what's not working, importantly, what help they need, checking in on their mental well-being as well as the flexibility they require to attend to whether it's childcare or elder care, and overall just what support is needed in general. And we've used that to really inform and shape every step that we've taken. So whether it's the communications that we do every 1 to 2 weeks, whether it's the safety protocols that we're putting in place, whether it's how we're thinking about actually redesigning the workspace, which puts the employee at the center, because we're really mindful for when employees are ready to come back into the workplace, and many are eager to get back into the office, then how do we ensure that workplace experience is one that reinforces our values around health and safety first and foremost, but also supports the purpose as to why they're coming into work. But it attends to some of the surprise and delight factors. So whether it's how we support potentially their shopping needs with buying groceries for their dinner that evening, or some other need they may have for well-being, we're being really thoughtful about the design of the workplace. And so they're co-creating that. And then finally, on the last point around those new habits and norms that we're going to need to adopt in a hybrid model, because it is important to provide some form of consistency and I think some guardrails so that employees do have a sense of what's okay, what's not okay, and how do they then structure the way in which they work within those guardrails.
Tamla, I want to switch over to you. We have a great audience question about if you started seeing trade-offs between the digital connection, which provides greater flexibility for employees, versus the tax, regulatory, other implications associated with employees who want to work from overseas or just different jurisdictions. What is the trade-off there? And is this something that the company has committed to addressing?
Fortunately for us, we have a lot of locations. So we can, even though people are working from home or working remotely, we can align them to one of our work locations and work sites. And so because we are North America, we do have about 800 employees in India. We don't have the working outside of North America issue. And right now, our work locations, because we have so many, as I said before, we've really been able to accommodate the workforce. But that is something that we are definitely looking at in a more strategic way, because sometimes we may get into a situation where we don't have that particular one-to-one match. And so we're looking at how do we handle that. We may even look at, designating certain hubs by geography so that we can earmark people that are working from home to that hub and maintain the integrity of any tax liability that we have. But it is something that I think we're going to continue to look at, make sure that obviously that we are operating in a compliant fashion. And there may be a situation where we have people that are not in a geography where we have an office that we may not be able to accommodate the remote office request. But so far, so good. We've been able to do that because of the number of sites that we have.
And we have another question coming in about vaccines. So, by now, almost every single state has announced universal eligibility or a date when universal eligibility for the vaccines will be available. How has this been changing your workforce? And can you talk to us a little bit about the trickiness of do you actually require a vaccine for some of your staff? Tamla, do you want to start, and then we'll go to the other panelists?
Absolutely. So we are not going to require. In fact, I think it would be hard to enforce right now, especially since the vaccine is still in the emergency stage. But we are strongly encouraging. We're providing a lot of information that will prove to be helpful to our employees. And then as leaders, as we take the vaccine, we are role modeling the behavior that we want to see. But at this point, we don't have any plans to require it, but we are strongly encouraging it. And we're trying to role model that behavior in a way that I think will manifest itself in a very positive way for our workforce, leading by example.
And Christy, what about you guys?
I would just say ditto to everything that Tamla just said, and we're strongly encouraging. We've been very actively promoting vaccine awareness and information. And, typically in the flu season, we run flu shot clinics. We're not allowed to do that right now, given the state of the vaccine distribution, and it's in the emergency authorization stages. But I think many of us as employers would look to work with the public health organizations to assist in that for our own employees, given the opportunity. And again, our benefits support it. We're actively promoting it, and we do not plan to have it as a requirement. And really, we find ourselves in this interesting position as employers. We've never really managed vaccine certification or anything like that. That's typically been handled through the school system or other public health venues. And I think on this area, we plan to follow whatever OSHA, CDC, and other guidelines come out.
Are you guys seeing any business implications around states or cities where there has been more vaccines? Like, are you seeing that show up in people returning to the workforce or even business coming back?
I can't say we have. We're in almost we're in every jurisdiction in the United States and a lot of countries around the world. I would say here, the U.S. is ahead of a lot of countries in terms of percent of the population vaccinated. And so we're seeing that. And I think that's critical to getting the economy reopened. So I think the two will go hand in hand.
And what about you guys, Kiersten?
So ditto, and what I would add to what's already been said is we've really focused on how do we get our employees access to the vaccine if for any reason they may have difficulty accessing a distribution centre. So we've fitted out many of our transits to provide refrigerated units so that the vaccine can be stored and more available both to our employees as well as members of the community. We've also reinforced that based on working with our own medical team and the external experts and CDC guidelines, that we're really clear that PPE will be an ongoing requirement even once you're vaccinated. So we're not requiring vaccinations like the other panelists, we're strongly encouraging it. And the requirement to continue to follow our safety protocols, which includes wearing PPE in the workplace, will continue at least for the short term.
How are you getting, how are you helping employees find access to appointments?
Well, the good thing
So
is
what we're doing is we,
go ahead, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kiersten.
So we've set up a microsite using our medical team who have worked with a number of different distribution agencies, healthcare providers. We've also had access to facilities in some of our communities. So the Ford Field, for instance, in Detroit has been converted to a vaccination site where we've got 6,000 members of the community going through and being vaccinated every day. And so we post regular updates, even multiple times a day, just letting employees know both availability but access to registration.
That's interesting. And Tamla, were you going to say something?
I was going to say ditto. There's a lot of information out there, so we're managing it from an enterprise perspective, providing kind of the microsites that have kind of the global information on there, but then we also have local sites that have local specific information that our people team are sharing with our employees in that regard. So we're trying to do both and to make sure that there's access. And the good thing is, in most of the states and cities and municipalities where we operate, there is now becoming an abundant supply, right now, and that's a good thing. That is a really good thing. But we do have employees in Canada that they are behind in terms of where we are from a U.S. perspective, and also in India. So when we communicate, we got to make sure we're bifurcating it by geography, because not all countries are created equal at this time, and we're communicating that as well.
That's really interesting. There's so many different balls that you guys are juggling. It's really amazing. I wanted to touch another audience question that I think is really important, asking about what responsibility do you put on managers to do check-ins with employees rather than just employee surveys or kind of mass communication. And what advice do you have to managers who are not only probably managing their own personal issues, but also have to be that empathetic ear to their teams? Christy, I want to start with you and then go around the panel.
To the audience, that's such a great question. So thanks for asking that. And I think it highlights one of the key things that we've all experienced during the last year with COVID, which is it's really a human crisis. And it's so important to keep that in mind. And I think because we were all thrust into it together, there's sort of a collective mindset. And so our leaders, our supervisors, our managers, they've found a lot of very creative ways to stay in touch with their teams, using a lot of the communication platforms we have in the company. Also just doing team touch-ins, calling in, checking in with folks. We encourage strongly to just keep in touch, reach out, text people. We also recognize for a lot of people, this has been a very isolating experience, where even, maybe they have been working remote or from home, or their family members have been on people they couldn't visit. And so for that reason as well, we've been highlighting a lot of the importance that, it's not just our company top-down communications, our one-stop COVID webpage, all of the material and content that we have for our folks, but that for each of them to keep those connections among each other is really important. And our teams have found really creative ways to do it. So I think that part's been very exciting. And there's in a lot of ways, people feel like they got to know their coworkers on a more personal and a deeper level through the crisis. And I think that's another one of those benefits we want to carry forward.
And Tamla, what about you? What advice would you give to a manager who's having to juggle both of these things?
The first thing is grant them a bit of grace, because you're trying to balance so much. Not only are they leading in a crisis, but they're also managing their personal life. The good thing about waste management, we are a very familial culture, and we're very close by default. So it wasn't hard for managers to stay connected to their workforce and to their employees, because that's just the nature of what they do and who we are as a company. What I will say is that as leaders, we've taken it as an SLT team, we've been more communicative to our workforce as well. So it's not just the manager that's managing the day-to-day, but we've improved and increased communication across the entire enterprise. So leaders across the entire company are communicating with the workforce. And we also have, very similar to Christy, we have our WM Now app where we're pushing out information. We have, a hotline where they could call. So there are multiple ways for them to get communicated to, but the onus is just not on that leader. We are helping them lead during this crisis because we realize they also have a lot of stuff going on.
And what about you, Kiersten?
So I'd say ditto to everything that's been said, and to build on that, we've focused a lot on habits. What are the new habits of work that we as people leaders need to adopt? And so one habit is starting every single meeting with a check-in, and the check-in questions can range from a broad range of topics, from just how are you feeling right now in this moment, to what's distracting you. Is it the dog barking, the lawn being mowed, the kids not attending school like they should? And just having that moment at the start of a business meeting to actually check in with how people are feeling and thinking at that point in time has been a really powerful way to connect and build that intimacy, but also build and create empathy, because how someone shows up for a business meeting may actually cover over some of the undercurrent issues that they may be dealing with, and then using that as a platform to reinforce some of the wellbeing resources and support tools that are available.